I didn't come out here looking for trouble. I came for silence. But the silence didn't last long, because on my first week at that old cabin, long before I knew the name Clearwater Bay, a black SUV with no plates rolled up to my tree line and just sat there, watching me. That's when the first chill ran through my bones, the kind you don't forget. When I first stepped onto that property, boots crunching over sun-baked pine needles, it felt like I had finally exhaled after holding my breath for 20 years straight. The air out there was different, sharper, cleaner, honest. It didn't smell like courtrooms or stale coffee or the sweat of a dozen men in suits pretending they weren't lying to each other. It smelled like pine sap, old timber, and the cold breath of the lake drifting uphill through the trees. The kind of air that makes you feel like maybe, just maybe, you haven't wasted your life after all. The cabin itself, well, most people would have turned around the second they saw it. Half the roof had caved in. The porch was a crooked jaw of broken boards. Windows were either shattered or hidden behind plywood, somebody nailed up 30 years ago. Vines had wrapped around the rails like they were trying to drag the whole structure into the dirt. But to me, it looked like redemption wearing a coat of dust. I'd won it at a county auction, one of those listings nobody wants because it's too remote, too run down, too forgotten by time. 3 acres tucked off an unmarked road, forest on 3 sides, the lake sitting quiet and silver on the 4th. No neighbors, no HOA, no city noise, no one breathing down my neck. I'd triple-checked the title, the parcel maps, even gone down to the assessor's office myself. After 20 years working inside the system, watching people twist laws like balloon animals, that cabin felt like a reset button. I didn't come out here with any illusions of making it pretty. I wasn't looking to turn the place into a magazine cover. I brought the basics. A generator I trusted more than most men, a stack of tools, a camping bed, a cooler full of water, and way too many cans of chili. My goal was simple: patch the roof, get the plumbing running, make the cabin safe enough to sleep without worrying a raccoon would curl up under my ribs at night. Those first few days were pure therapy. I tore off rotten shingles, hammered new boards into place, swept out a decade of dust. I slept under the stars the first night. By day 4, I had a roof that didn't leak. By day 5, I installed solar panels and 2 small cameras facing the drive. Not because I expected trouble, just because old habits don't die easy when you've spent 2 decades chasing people who specialize in making trouble. There's a certain paranoia you earn over time, and it sticks to you like old scars. The quiet was something I adjusted to faster than I expected. At night, the only sounds were owls and the wind moving through the trees in slow waves, like the forest was breathing. I'd forgotten silence could be heavy in a good way. I'd forgotten how good it felt to hear nothing and trust it. For a week, I didn't see a soul. Not a hiker, not a hunter, not even a lost fisherman looking for the lake. Then, right when I started thinking the world had finally left me alone, that's when things changed. I was up on the roof patching the last row of shingles when I heard the low crunch of gravel. Not the drive, my drive was still too overgrown for a car, but the narrow path that ran parallel to the tree line. I turned my head, and there it was, a black SUV, tinted windows, no plates, engine idling just loud enough to let me know it was there. It didn't pull in, didn't honk, didn't open a door. It just stopped at the edge of the woods like it was studying me through the dark glass. I stood there on the ladder, hammer in one hand, trying to decide whether to shout or stay quiet. But before I could choose, the SUV slowly reversed, disappeared behind the trees, and vanished down the dirt path the same way it came. Weird, I thought, but not impossible. Lost hiker, curious passerby, someone checking out land values? I didn't know. But my gut whispered something different. It whispered, "Remember this moment." Because things were about to get worse. Much worse. I tried to brush off the SUV. I really did. I told myself it was nothing. Just someone who took a wrong turn or got curious about the old cabin someone was finally patching up. But truth is, when you've spent years dealing with criminals who pretend to be harmless, your instincts get sharper than your eyesight. And my instincts, they weren't buying the lost traveler theory. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. Not because I wanted to, but because something felt off in the air. The cabin was quiet. Too quiet. Even the birds hadn't started their morning chatter yet. I stepped out onto the porch, boots touching the cold wood, and took a slow look around. That's when I saw it. My gate what was left of it, was hanging off a single hinge, like someone had tried to shoulder it open in the middle of the night. The top hinge bolts were ripped clean out of the post, the wood fibers still fresh and splintered, pointing outward like little accusing fingers. And right in the middle of the drive, hammered deep into the dirt, was a wooden stake. On it hung a shiny aluminum sign. Private community area, no trespassing. The letters gleamed like they wanted me to read them twice. I just stood there for a moment, staring, trying to figure out if this was some kind of joke. But there's a certain heaviness to a sign someone means you to see. Whoever put it there knew exactly what they were doing. It wasn't county issued, wasn't state issued, wasn't legal in any form I've ever known. It looked brand new, almost too new, like it had been printed yesterday specifically for me. I took my phone out and started recording. Old habit. I filmed the broken gate from every angle. I filmed the sign. I filmed the ground around it, the pattern of boot prints, the tire marks leading back into the woods, not the road. Whoever came by during the night hadn't driven in from the front. They'd come from behind the tree line, from the woods. That told me more than the sign ever could. Someone knew this land well enough to approach from the back, where the old logging path ran. Someone who had been here before, someone familiar with the terrain. I finished recording and followed the tire tracks with my eyes. They vanished into the thick pines so cleanly you'd think the forest swallowed them whole. Something about that chilled me. Not fear, just awareness. Like hearing a twig snap behind you when you thought you were alone. I went ahead and reinforced the gate with a crossbar of fresh lumber. Then I set up another camera facing the drive, a little higher this time, angled down. I added one more pointing toward the woods. I didn't expect it would stop anything, but it made me feel like I was at least watching back. As I tightened the last screw, a strange feeling crept up the back of my neck, like being observed. Not directly, not openly, more like the forest itself was holding its breath. By the time the sun finally broke through the treetops, that sign was still there, shining bright like a warning I didn't ask for. And deep down, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever had looked at me through the tinted glass of that SUV wasn't finished with me yet. It didn't take long for the next sign to show itself. By the third morning, I realized something out here wasn't just watching me, it was testing me. I'd gone inside to make coffee, instant coffee, bitter enough to put hair on your chest. And when I came back outside, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. The air had that same dry chill. The lake breeze was steady, the trees were doing what trees do. But the cabin had a different weight on it, like it was being examined. I walked around the property slowly, the mug warm in my hands, steam rising into the early cold. Then I saw it. One of my solar panels, installed just 2 days earlier, was pointed straight at the sky, not angled, not nudged, not blown by wind, rotated, manually. The bolts loosened just enough that the panel wouldn't catch sunlight, but also wouldn't break. Someone had climbed up there, unscrewed the mount, tilted it away from the sun, and left without leaving a footprint. That took time. That took care. That took intention. I put the coffee down and knelt to study the mount. The edges of the bolts had faint scratches, fresh ones, tiny grooves from a tool that wasn't mine. My own wrench left different patterns. Whoever touched this knew they didn't need to destroy anything. Just weaken me, drain my power supply, make nights harder. I stood there for a moment, breathing slow, letting the reality settle. They didn't want to be seen. They wanted to send a message. I retightened everything, climbed down, and checked the rest of the system. Then I walked the perimeter again. I didn't see any footprints, but the ground here was soft pine bed, not soil. Anyone careful enough could walk through without leaving a trace. I grabbed my phone and checked the camera feeds. That's when my stomach tightened. Camera 1, offline. Camera 2, offline. Camera 3, frozen at 3:18 a.m. Only the newest one, the one I'd placed yesterday, was still functioning. The feeds weren't cut, they were disabled, either unplugged or jammed. I opened the door to check the wiring panel and saw something that made my pulse kick. A faint smear of mud on the frame, not a lot, just one small streak. Dark brown, thin. Someone had touched the door, not enough to break in, not enough to leave obvious marks, just enough to say, "We got close." I wiped it with my thumb, felt the grit, the moisture still in it, fresh, within hours. I took a long breath and stepped back. I wasn't afraid, but I wasn't alone anymore, and that was worse than fear. It meant planning, it meant purpose. I spent the next hour strengthening the door latch, adding a metal brace across the inside. I checked each window and every screw holding down the panels. Then I walked the tree line, scanning for anything. Trash, footprints, cigarette butts, broken branches. That's when I found the tire marks. About 30 feet behind the cabin, sharp impressions cutting into the soft soil. Deep, fresh, and facing toward my property. They weren't from my truck. They weren't from the front road. They came from the old woods trail, the same direction the SUV had gone. I knelt and ran my hand across the track, feeling the pattern of the tread, the shape of the grooves, wide tires, off-road. Not the kind your average hiker drives. And there were two sets, one coming in, one going out. As I stood there, a cold breeze passed through the pines and brushed against my neck. Not strong enough to move branches, just enough to make me feel exposed, like eyes were on me again. I turned slowly, listening for anything. Breathing, footsteps, the click of a twig. But the forest stayed silent. Too silent, like it was listening back. I walked inside and locked the door behind me. When I checked my phone again, the signal bar flickered. One line, then none, then frozen. The timing wasn't random. Nothing about this was random. Someone out there was measuring me, watching me, prodding me like a cattle gate to see how much pressure I'd take before breaking. And I had the sinking feeling that whatever was coming next wasn't going to be subtle. The first time they walked onto my land, they didn't sneak or slither or wait until dark. No, men like that don't hide. They want to be seen. They want dominance to arrive before their footsteps do. It was late morning, a little after 10. The sun was warm enough to settle into my shoulders while I cleared debris from the old tool shed. I had my sleeves rolled up, hands dirty, mind focused on the rhythm of work. The kind of rhythm that makes a man forget the things that bothered him yesterday. Then I heard it. Boots, heavy ones, crunching gravel that shouldn't have been crunching. I straightened, listening. The sound wasn't coming from the main drive. It was coming from the narrow path near the woods, the one barely wide enough for a four-wheeler. And whoever was walking, there was more than one. 3 shapes emerged between the trees like they had been cut out of the shadows themselves. They wore matching forest green polo shirts tucked into dark cargo pants. Each shirt had a gold emblem on the chest, a mountain and a wreath surrounding the words, Clearwater Bay Security Patrol. The words Security Patrol weren't small. They were big enough to fill their chests. The man in front was hard to miss. Tall, probably mid-50s, the kind of barrel-chested build you get from a life spent pushing people around rather than lifting weights. His jaw looked like it was carved from old river stone, his hair cut military short, his eyes small and mean behind a lifetime of sun and anger. Henry Lott. Though I didn't know his name yet, just the type. Behind him, 2 men flanked out, one holding a phone up and recording like it was routine. The other opening his jacket just enough that I could see the holstered pistol on his hip. Not police issue, private, probably legal, definitely meant to be noticed. They walked straight toward me without slowing down. "Morning," I said, keeping my voice level, neutral. Neutral matters with men like this. The barrel-chested one didn't return the courtesy. "You can't be out here," he said flatly. No introduction, no greeting, just authority spoken like a hammer hitting wood. I blinked once, not out of confusion, out of disbelief that someone would open with that line on my land. "I'm sorry?" I asked. "This is Clearwater Bay jurisdiction," he said, taking 2 steps closer. "You're trespassing on HOA managed property." I studied his face. No humor there, not even an attempt to soften the absurdity. I exhaled slowly. "No, this is my property, purchased at auction last month, recorded with the county. I've got the title, parcel map, and the GPS coordinates, all clean." His lips curled into something halfway between a smirk and a snarl. "You think that matters?" he said. "You can wave your little courthouse papers around all you want. We don't go by courthouse politics. We go by the community charter. And this," he gestured at the cabin with a stiff chin, "this falls under our purview." The other 2 began spreading out, casually, like they were securing a perimeter. One filmed my cabin. The other walked toward my firewood stack, pretending to look at property markers that did not exist. My pulse ticked higher, not fear, the kind of anger that starts as heat in the chest. I pulled out my tablet, the one where I kept the parcel maps loaded. I turned it toward him. "This is my land," I said. "Not part of any HOA. The county confirmed that twice." Without warning, he snatched the tablet right out of my hand. Reflex kicked in. I grabbed for it instantly. And for one stupid second, the two of us were locked in a silent tug of war like angry children fighting over a toy. Except his grip wasn't childish. His grip was threatening. I tore the tablet back and stepped away fast. My jaw clenched so tight I felt it pop. "Touch me again," I said quietly, "and you'll regret it." He leaned in, too close for anyone with good intentions, and said in a low, gravelly voice, "You threatening me?" "No," I said. "I'm telling you what happens next." For a few tense seconds, nobody moved. Even the forest seemed to pause. The two men finally stopped pretending to look around and drifted back toward their leader. They stood there like they were waiting for me to flinch. I didn't. After a long, uncomfortable silence, he lifted his hand and motioned his men away. "This isn't over," he said. "You'll be hearing from us." They turned their backs and walked toward the dark green Jeep Wrangler hidden just beyond the trees. No license plates, just the same gold HOA decal on the back window. Before getting inside, Henry looked back over his shoulder, smirked, and said, "Oh, and cell service is spotty out here. Careful you don't end up needing help you can't call for." Then the Jeep rolled away, the engine rumbling low, leaving a cloud of dust and 3 sets of boot prints leading right across my land. I stood there long after they were gone, not shaken, but something in me had shifted, like an old instinct waking up from a long sleep, because if those men thought that walking onto my land made it theirs, then things were about to get real complicated. I didn't go back to work right away. When you've dealt with enough dangerous men in your life, you learn to listen to the silence after they leave. Sometimes that silence tells you everything you need to know, and that afternoon, the silence was wrong. Too still, too heavy, like the trees were waiting for something. I pulled out my phone, planning to call the sheriff. Not that I expected much from a small rural department on a weekday morning, but at least it had put something on record. No signal, not one bar, not even a flicker. I walked around the clearing, holding the phone higher like a fool trying to catch a rogue breeze. Nothing. The little icon didn't even try. It just sat there, with a dead gray slash through it. I frowned. 2 days ago, the signal was weak, but still usable. I'd made calls from that porch, sent emails, pulled up maps. Now it was gone like someone flipped a switch. "Okay," I muttered to myself. "Here we go." I checked the router for the hotspot. The indicator was red. Not blinking, solid red. That meant one of two things. Either the tower went down, or someone was interrupting the connection. I stepped back and scanned the tree line. There are certain devices you can buy online, illegal in most states, that can jam signal within a very tight radius. They're small, portable, battery-powered. If someone hid one in the woods on a timer, it would turn this entire property into a dead zone. And the words Henry used earlier echoed in my mind. "Careful you don't end up needing help you can't call for." It wasn't a threat. It was the thesis statement of what they were planning. That night, the real show began. It started with a dog barking. Not one bark, not a real dog, not close, but a loop. A perfect 30-second interval, the same bark, same pitch, same cadence. It echoed faintly from somewhere far off in the woods. A recording, played through a speaker I couldn't locate. I listened for 10 minutes, counting the timing, the rhythm. It never changed. After the dog came a buzzing hum, the kind of high-frequency tone that gets under your skin and sits there like a splinter. Not loud, not painful, just irritating, impossible to ignore. It rattled the tin in the walls, vibrated the hinges of the cabin door. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Silence again. I stood inside the cabin, shotgun leaning against the counter, lights off, eyes adjusting to darkness. I waited, counting heartbeats. I don't know how long, maybe 2 minutes, maybe 10, when a sound thudded through the wall behind me. 3 sharp knocks, deliberate, measured, not on the door, on the side of the cabin, just outside the camera's blind spot. I held my breath. Then I forced myself to move, to step toward the window, slow and quiet. I nudged the curtain a fraction of an inch. Nothing, just trees and darkness. The knocks didn't repeat. I didn't go outside. Only rookies and fools chase noises in the woods at night. Instead, I slid the metal bar I'd installed earlier across the door and sat down on the edge of the cot, shotgun barrel resting lightly against my knee. The generator hiccuped once, coughed, then died, even though I'd topped it up earlier. The timing wasn't coincidence. It was orchestration. They were turning the lights off on purpose, trying to shrink my world, trying to make the darkness feel alive. I grabbed a flashlight, walked to the back window, and peered out across the clearing. The moon cut slices of white between the pines. The air felt too still, too staged. For a moment, I wondered who else they'd done this to. Because this wasn't some neighborhood dispute. This was a pressure campaign, a tactic I'd seen used by gangs, crooked debt collectors, even certain federal units back in my day. They weren't trying to kill me, not yet. They were trying to exhaust me, drain me, break me down one night at a time until I packed up and left. I wrote down everything in a small notebook. Times, sounds, interruptions, outages. Documentation is the only weapon you can always rely on. And I'll admit something I haven't told many people. That night, sitting there in the half-dark cabin, with my breath fogging in the cold air and the radio silent, I felt the edge of something I hadn't felt in years. Not fear, something sharper, resolve. They picked the wrong man to corner in the dark. Because I knew, down to my bones, that whatever they were planning next would be bigger, louder, and bolder. And I was already getting ready for it. The first real break came on a night cold enough that every breath inside the cabin felt like I was exhaling smoke. I'd been sitting on the edge of the cot for hours, listening to the forest breathe. No humming sounds tonight. No barking loops. No knocks, which, honestly, worried me more. The woods were too quiet, like something was holding its breath out there. At 2:40 a.m., my phone buzzed. Not with a call, not with a message, with a camera alert. East side motion detected. I tapped the screen instantly. The live stream flickered once, then came into focus. Two figures, both masked, both dressed in dark clothing, no reflective surfaces, no logos. They moved slow, confident, practiced. Not kids, not drunks, not trespassers looking for scrap metal, men on a job. One carried something in his hand, a flashlight, or maybe a scanner of some kind. He swept it along the windows like he was checking for heat or movement. The other crouched low near the front steps, working the latch with a tool that caught the moonlight, a narrow metal hook, the kind used for bypassing cheap locks. My pulse didn't spike. It settled, the way it always used to when a situation turned real. I slid off the cot, feet touching cold floorboards, and moved silently to where the shotgun leaned beside the counter. I didn't point it, didn't need to. I just racked it once, loud and unmistakable. Ch-chack. The sound echoed through the cabin like thunder in a canyon. I took a deep breath and shouted through the door. One more step closer and this becomes a felony scene. The sheriff has the footage and the cameras are rolling. I lied about the sheriff, but the cameras, those were very real. Outside, everything froze. The man at the door jerked his head toward his partner. For a split second, neither moved. Then, as if someone cut their strings, they bolted, fast. One sprinted toward the back tree line. The other ran around the cabin, disappearing behind the shed. I didn't chase them. A man doesn't chase shadows into the woods at night unless he wants to vanish with them. Instead, I flipped on every light I had, spotlights, porch lamps, the backup LEDs I'd rigged along the roof. The clearing lit up like a county fair, every tree casting long, hard shadows. By the time I stepped outside, boots on, shotgun slung low and ready, all I caught was the sound of branches snapping farther out in the dark. But they left things behind. Near the porch steps, half buried in the dirt, was a crowbar. Not old, not rusted. Recently used, the metal still warm from a grip. Beside it, a two-way radio lying face down. When I picked it up, it crackled softly. Static at first, then a faint voice breaking through. Hold, pulling back, wait for, then silence. Whatever frequency they were using wasn't police. Wasn't civilian either. It was a private channel. Nearby, I spotted footprints, military-style boots, deep tread, size maybe 11 or 12. Big men. I took photos of everything. The prints, the tools, the radio, the position of the shed door where the lower hinges had fresh scratches. I even photographed the angle of the moon and the shadows. Details matter more than people realize. Then I went back inside, locked every bolt, and sat down with the radio on the table in front of me. For a long moment, I just stared at it, listening to the faint hum of static. It felt like the device was breathing, like it knew something I didn't. And then it hit me. This wasn't random. This wasn't petty vandalism. This was reconnaissance, testing weak points, mapping entry paths, seeing how fast I reacted. Someone out there was building a plan around me, and I had the sinking feeling that next time, they wouldn't run. By sunrise, I hadn't slept, not a minute. The adrenaline that carried me through the night had burned off, leaving behind a kind of cold clarity I hadn't felt in years. That's the thing about real danger. It sharpens a man more than coffee ever could. I stepped out onto the porch with the radio in one hand and the crowbar in the other, both lying on the railing like trophies I didn't want but couldn't ignore. The woods looked calm, too calm, the kind of morning peace that feels staged, like the quiet after a staged storm. Then I heard the sound of a truck engine rolling up the gravel road. Slow, heavy, familiar. A dusty silver Chevy rounded the bend and eased into my clearing. Even before I saw the driver, I knew who it had to be. Not many people would drive all the way out here uninvited, especially at dawn. Colton stepped out, holding a paper cup of gas station coffee in one hand and squinting through the early light like he was staring down a suspect from 20 years back. Same old Colton, same tired eyes, same ugly black notebook sticking out of his jacket pocket. He took one look at me, then at the scattered footprints near the steps, then at the crowbar. "Hell," he muttered. "I take 1 week off and you start a war." I didn't smile, but something in my chest loosened a little. "What are you doing here?" I asked. "You texted me a photo at 3 in the morning," he said, sipping the coffee. "When a man sends me a picture of a crowbar on his porch at that hour, I assume he's either drunk or in trouble. And you're too boring to be drunk." He stepped closer, scanning the yard with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man who'd spent decades walking crime scenes. "Boot prints," he said quietly. "Fresh, size 11 or 12, heavy, military sole, someone tall." He crouched next to the tracks near the tree line, tracing the edges with a fingertip. "No rain last night," he added. "Means these were made after 2 a.m. I handed him the radio. He turned it over carefully, studying the frequency dial and antenna mount. "This isn't store-bought," he said. "They're using private channels, organized." "I figured," I said. He stood and looked at me with an expression I'd seen only a handful of times. Concern, not fear, not shock, just that quiet, serious concern that says, "You're in deep, and I'm stepping in now." "Tell me everything," he said. So I did. The SUV, the sign, the broken gate. Henry Lott and his little parade of self-appointed stormtroopers, the disabled panels, the signal dead zone, the dog recording in the night, the knocks on the wall, and finally, the 2 masked men at 2:40 in the morning. Colton listened without interrupting, only nodding when he needed to. When I finished, he took a long breath and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "This is a pattern," he said. "Not a one-off, not amateurs either. This feels like a pressure campaign." I raised an eyebrow. "HOA-style pressure," Colton snorted. "I've met cartel guys with more subtlety." He walked around the cabin, inspecting things as he spoke. "They're testing you, gauging your response time, seeing if you'll call for help, or if you even can. Probably taking notes, probably passing them up the chain." "Up the chain to who?" I asked. "I don't know yet," he said. "But somebody's running this, and they've done it before." He took out his ugly black notebook and flipped through the pages. "You know what this reminds me of?" he asked. "What?" "That farm case outside Olympia. The one where the developer hired private security to chase out the old widow so they could grab her plot. Same tactics, same nighttime hits, same intimidation cycles." "And we shut that down," I said. Colton looked at me directly. "Yeah, because we documented everything. Because we were a wall they couldn't push over." He tapped my porch rail with the pen. "You need to understand something. This isn't about noise or scares. They're not trying to spook you. They're trying to evaluate you. They want to know if you'll bend or break before they escalate." "Well," I said, "they're about to find out I don't bend." Colton grinned slightly. "Good, because we're going to war with clipboards and cameras instead of bullets." He took one last look at the woods. "I'll stay in town a few days," he said. "Run by the sheriff's office, pull county records, see what Clearwater Bay has been up to." Then he clapped a hand on my shoulder, firm and steady. "You're not alone out here anymore," he said. "Whatever this is, we'll peel it back layer by layer." For the first time since this whole mess started, the cabin didn't feel quite so small, or so quiet, or so outnumbered. because now there were two of us, and two men who know how to follow a trail are harder to scare than one. 3 days passed with no more midnight visitors, which sounds like peace, but anyone who has ever done surveillance or hunted dangerous men knows the truth. Silence is never peace. Silence is planning. Colton spent his days driving into town, digging through county records, talking to people who didn't like talking, and pulling little threads that made the whole sweater start unraveling. Every evening, he'd swing by the cabin long enough to drink a coffee and scribble in that black notebook of his before heading back to his motel. And me? I stayed put, watched the woods, patched the cabin, waited for the next move. It came on a Wednesday morning that smelled like rain and wood smoke. I was splitting firewood behind the cabin, letting the rhythm clear my mind, when I heard tires on gravel again. Not slow and sneaky like the SUV, not rumbling like Colton's Chevy, something smoother. Newer, expensive. I stepped around the corner just in time to see a pearl-white Lexus gliding into my clearing, like it didn't belong to the dirt or the dust at all. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a woman who looked like she'd been airbrushed out of a politician's campaign billboard. Platinum hair locked into a shell of hairspray, designer sunglasses big enough to block sunlight from 3 states, a tailored pastel jacket, a matching skirt, heels that did not belong anywhere near the woods. And in her hands was a pie, a perfect golden brown peach pie in a shiny aluminum tin. She smiled, the kind of smile people practice in mirrors. "Mr. Sloan," she called out warmly, like we were old friends. My stomach tightened, because I knew the type before she even reached the porch. A smile like that always hides a blade. I set the axe aside and walked forward slowly. "Ma'am, you're on private property." "Oh, hush," she said, waving the words away as though boundaries were suggestions. "I'm just being neighborly, and please, call me Karen. Karen Sheldon, president of the Clearwater Bay Homeowners Association." There it was, the name, the title, the source of every shadow that had been crawling through my trees. She held the pie toward me like an offering. "I thought it was time we had a friendly, civilized conversation," she said. "I brought you something homemade. My late husband used to love my peach pies." Her voice was sweet, honey-soaked, but her eyes behind those sunglasses were calculating everything they landed on. My porch, my tools, my cameras, my stance. I looked down at the pie. Something felt off. I reached out, not to take it, but to tilt the tin just enough to catch the underside of the pan. A small white sticker clung to the bottom, a supermarket barcode, $12.99, homemade, my foot. I let the pie go and straightened. "Well, Karen," I said, "you're trespassing." She laughed, a nervous tinkling sound like glass tapping glass. "Oh dear, let's not act so formal. We really do want to welcome you to the community. It's just, well, there's been some confusion regarding boundaries. Some of the older maps are misleading, and we believe your parcel may actually fall within. I'm not part of your community." She paused, not long, just enough for her mask to slip a single millimeter. "Well, not yet," she said, regaining her smile. "But the board would be happy to review your application. We could make this transition seamless." "I'm not joining an HOA," I said, "and I'm not paying dues to people who break onto my land at night." She didn't flinch, but the muscles around her jaw tightened, just barely. Karen placed the pie, her homemade pie, on my porch railing like she was leaving an offering to the gods. Then she stepped backward toward her Lexus. "Well," she said softly, "we'll be in touch if anything arises." She opened her car door, glanced back over her shoulder, and added, "I really do hope we won't have to escalate anything." Then the door shut. The Lexus purred, and she drifted back down my road, leaving a faint trail of perfume and lies behind her. I didn't touch the pie, because that wasn't a gift. It was a warning wrapped in pastry. Colton came back that afternoon looking like he'd spent the whole day dragging answers out of people who didn't want to give them. Dust clung to his boots, and his shirt had that wrinkled, sweat-settled look of a man who had been inside courthouses, county offices, and places where truth goes to hide. He didn't bother with a greeting. He just stepped onto my porch, dropped a folder onto the little table beside the untouched peach pie, and said, "You need to see this." I opened the folder, and the first thing I saw was a map. Not a county parcel map, not a surveyor's print, a developer's blueprint, sleek, color-coded, professionally drafted. It showed the lake, the surrounding forest, the planned roads, the future lots. And then there was my land, highlighted, circled, labeled in bold red letters, Tract D, pending acquisition. Colton leaned his knuckles against the table. This isn't just an HOA being greedy, he said. They're not trying to shake you down for dues. They're not even trying to scare you out of the neighborhood. He tapped the circled section with the back of his pen. Your 3 acres are the last piece they need. I stared at the blueprint. Last piece for what? I asked. Colton pulled out the next sheet, a glossy concept rendering, the kind you see in investor decks and real estate expos. Clearwater Lakeside Resort and Conference Retreat projected value, $62.5 million, construction partner, Northwest Alpine Developments, LLC. A man doesn't have to be an economist to read those numbers. My land wasn't just land, it was leverage. It was the missing puzzle piece that connected the lakefront shoreline to the only flat plateau big enough for the main lodge, tennis courts, and luxury parking. Without my 3 acres, the resort couldn't break ground. With it, they controlled the entire lakefront. So that's why they're doing this, I said quietly. Colton nodded. Yep, Karen's HOA isn't acting alone. She's a middleman, a gatekeeper. And Henry Lott? Enforcer, hired under the table. His job is to make this parcel problem-free. I leaned back in the chair and exhaled long and slow. It all clicked. The intimidation, the nighttime hits, the signal jamming, the boundary confusion, the fake 1986 easement document, the man from the holding company with no bar license, the HOA sign planted in the driveway. They weren't improvising. They were executing a plan someone had drawn up long before I even stepped foot here. Colton took a sip of his coffee and continued. I talked to a clerk at the assessor's office. Off the record, she said Clearwater Bay HOA has been trying to absorb adjacent lands for the past 5 years, but they've never pushed this hard on anyone before. Why me? He tapped the blueprint again. Because the previous owner left the parcel vacant for so long. Easy target. No protests, no oversight, no legal pushback. And when the county put it up for auction, the HOA assumed they'd be the only bidders. I felt heat rise in my jaw. They didn't expect someone from out of state to swoop in and buy it. No, Colton said. They expected Karen to get it for pennies, transfer it to the developer, and split the profit. I looked up sharply. He raised a hand. Not officially, of course, but I found a payment routing, offshore, quiet. 2 months ago, a shell corporation, KBR Holdings, wired $50,000 into the HOA's infrastructure fund. Same week, Karen filed a petition to redraw the community boundary zones. He leaned close. That $50,000 was a down payment. I sat in silence for a moment, letting it all settle like silt in a riverbed. A multi-million-dollar resort, a land grab, a coordinated harassment campaign, a fake easement, night raids, signal jamming, paid muscle, a president with a smile like a knife. All because I owned 3 acres. 3 acres that I wasn't giving up. Colton straightened and closed the folder. They want you gone, he said plainly. Quietly, if possible. Forcefully, if necessary. Because to them, you're not a person. You're an obstacle, a dollar sign in the way. I looked out toward the lake, watching ripples shimmer in the late afternoon sun. Well, I finally said, they picked the wrong obstacle. Colton cracked a faint smile. That's what I told the clerk, he said. And just like that, the picture became crystal clear. This wasn't about neighbors, or rules, or land confusion. This was a $1 million war dressed up in polo shirts and clipboards. And the cabin wasn't just my home anymore. It was a battleground. The night before the ambush felt wrong from the moment the sun went down. The air had that metallic taste, like the world was holding its breath before something breaks. Even the birds quieted early. The woods weren't sleeping. They were bracing. Colton had stayed late. We pored over county filings, HOA emails, and receipts showing the so-called infrastructure fund was really just a wash account for bribe money. Around midnight, he finally stood, rubbed his neck, and said, I'm heading to the car, going to sleep out there tonight. Something feels off. He always had good instincts, and that night, mine lined up with his perfectly. I killed the lights in the cabin, left only the soft glow of the monitor screen angled toward the door. The cameras were live, the shotgun was loaded, and my nerves, steady, too steady, the way they get when you know the fight is coming. The first hint wasn't sound, it was shadow. A shape moved at the far edge of the clearing, big, slow, deliberate, then a second, then a third. Low moonlight glinted off something metallic. Tools, weapons, couldn't tell yet. My phone buzzed. North perimeter motion detected. Then another alert. West camera feed obscured. They were cutting blind spots. Professionals. I crouched low, peering through the sliver between curtain and wall. A dark SUV, same kind as before, rolled silently into view, headlights off. The doors opened, and 3 men stepped out. 2 wore black hooded jackets, but the man in front, that frame, that walk, Henry Lott, back again. And this time, he wasn't pretending to talk. He moved like a man who came to finish something. One of the men carried bolt cutters, another carried a pry bar. Henry had nothing in his hands, and that made him the most dangerous one of the bunch. I whispered into the small radio Colton had left with me. 3 incoming, Henry's here. Colton's voice came back low, steady, like he was back on the job again. Copy, sit tight. The men split up. One stalked toward the shed. One moved along the cabin wall, running gloved fingers over the siding like he was searching for wiring. Henry walked straight toward the front steps, slow, unhurried, like he was walking into his own house. I stepped back, racked the shotgun once, loud enough to make dust fall from the rafters, and shouted, "You take one more step, and this is criminal trespass armed with intent!" Henry didn't stop, didn't even blink. He stepped onto the first stair, leaned in close to the door, and spoke in a low growl that seeped through the wood like smoke. "You should have left when we gave you the chance." I opened my mouth to answer, but that's when a second noise cut him off. Not footsteps, not tools, not voices, a click. The unmistakable click of a hammer being drawn back on a handgun. Colton's voice followed. "Henry, step away from the door." Henry froze, turned his head slowly. Colton stood at the bottom of the steps, legs planted wide, Glock leveled, flashlight in his offhand, cutting a clean beam right across Henry's chest. "You again," Henry muttered. "Yeah," Colton said. "Me again. Now step back." Henry smiled a little, one of those mean, crooked smiles men like him use when they think things are about to go their way. "You gonna shoot, cop?" "I'm not a cop anymore." Colton's voice didn't rise, didn't waver. "But I'm still licensed, and you're still trespassing with a weapon." Henry lunged, not toward me, not toward Colton, toward the gun. It happened fast, too fast for a man his age, but Colton moved faster. He pivoted sideways, let Henry's weight pass him, grabbed a fistful of his jacket, and used the momentum to drive him hard into the dirt. The two of them hit the ground in a tangle of fists and elbows. Henry swung wide, heavy punches that could crack ribs. Colton ducked the first, blocked the second, and caught the third with his forearm. I kicked the cabin door open and leveled the shotgun. "Enough!" The 2 other intruders froze mid-step. Henry stopped struggling. Colton kept his knee planted on Henry's spine, one hand still gripping Henry's wrist and pinning it to the ground. "Don't move," Colton said quietly. I kept the shotgun trained on the other 2, who suddenly looked a lot less brave without their leader standing upright. "Drop the tools," I said. Bolt cutters hit the ground. The pry bar clanged beside them. Blue and red lights flashed through the trees, slow, winding, cautious. The sheriff's deputies, finally close enough to matter. By the time they reached the clearing, they found 2 men standing with hands raised, 1 man face down under Colton's knee, and me holding a shotgun like someone who'd had enough. Henry snarled as they cuffed him. "This isn't over," he spat. I leaned down just enough for him to hear. "You're right, it's just starting." And the look he gave me, anger mixed with the first flicker of fear, told me he finally understood. I wasn't leaving. I wasn't bending, and I damn sure wasn't scared of him. Courtrooms have a sound. If you've spent enough years in them, the echo becomes familiar. The shuffle of papers, the creak of old benches, the quiet cough from someone who wishes they were anywhere but here. But that morning in Libby, Montana, it didn't sound like any courtroom I'd ever stepped into. It sounded charged, like static before a lightning strike. Reporters filled the hallway outside, camera crews hunched over tripods. Local folks, some angry, some curious, clustered around signs that read things like, HOA is not the law. Cabin rights are human rights. End community extortion. Colton and I took our seats at the plaintiff's bench. He wore a pressed shirt for once. Still had that ugly black notebook, though. Good omen. The bailiff announced the first arrival. Karen Sheldon entered like she was stepping onto a red carpet instead of facing felony charges. Pearls, tailored jacket, hair sprayed so stiff it might have survived a hurricane. She gave the cameras a polished smile, one she must have practiced 1,000 times. But there was something behind the sunglasses, a twitch, a tightness, fear. Henry Lott followed next, flanked by 2 deputies. Without the green HOA shirt and fake authority, he looked smaller, older, the kind of man whose power came solely from intimidation, now neutralized. He didn't look at me, not yet. The judge was a tall woman named Rita Carver, known around the county for 2 things: despising bureaucracy and hating liars even more. The prosecutions began by reading out the charges, 6 of them, each one heavier than the last: conspiracy to intimidate, falsification of property documents, unlawful surveillance, trespassing, incitement to commit criminal trespass, tampering with communication infrastructure. Karen sat straight-backed as each charge was listed, lips pressed so thin they almost disappeared. The prosecution started with video evidence, the footage Colton and I had captured. The night raids, the broken lights, the masked intruders, the crowbars, the radio channel, all of it displayed on a large monitor. You could feel the courtroom shift, murmurs spreading like wildfire. Then came the internal HOA emails. One line projected big enough for even the reporters in the back to see. Apply noise cycle, disable solar, stage another presence event. He's cracking. Give it a few more days. Karen's jaw twitched in a way makeup couldn't hide, but the room didn't truly explode until the prosecutor called their next witness, Sheriff Paul Granger. The sheriff walked in stiffly, hat clutched against his chest. I sensed the tension rolling off him. He avoided looking at Karen entirely. I understand you were contacted multiple times about harassment at the plaintiff's property, the prosecutor said. Yes, ma'am, the sheriff answered, voice heavy. I was. And why did you not respond with urgency? Granger hesitated, swallowed. Because, he started, I was told it was a boundary dispute, that the HOA had authority. I was advised to stay clear unless violence occurred. Advised by whom? Another hesitation, longer this time. Mrs. Sheldon. A collective gasp swept the room. Karen's head snapped toward him. If looks could kill, the sheriff would have dropped dead on the spot. And what changed your stance? The prosecutor pressed. Granger exhaled. Evidence, Mr. Sloan's videos, Mr. Cooper's, Colton's documentation. It became clear the HOA wasn't enforcing rules. They were orchestrating intimidation. And is it true, the prosecutor continued, that you personally ordered the arrest of Henry Lott during the second break-in? Yes, ma'am. On review of footage, it was criminal trespass with intent. The sheriff sat down. His testimony was a nail in the coffin. But the twist? The twist came next. The prosecutor called Henry Lott. The room went dead quiet as Henry shuffled to the stand. He didn't look defiant. He didn't look angry. He looked tired. The prosecutor straightened her notes. Mr. Lott, can you describe your role in Clearwater Bay's security? Henry stared at his hands for a long moment. Then he looked up, right at me. My role was to push him out, he said plainly. Whatever way worked. A roaring murmur filled the room. And who gave those orders? The prosecutor asked calmly. Henry swallowed. A muscle jumped in his cheek. Karen did. Gasps. Flashes from cameras. Karen's lawyer nearly choked. Henry continued, voice cracking just slightly. She said the resort deal depended on clearing that land. Told us to make it unlivable for the new owner. Noise, lights, night visits. Break a few things. Don't get caught. He paused. And I recorded the call. The courtroom detonated. Reporters scrambled. Karen's face drained of all color beneath the makeup. Her lawyer whispered frantically, trying to contain a wildfire with a glass of water. The judge slammed her gavel. Order! Once the room settled, the prosecution played the audio. Karen's voice filled the speakers, sharp, cold, unmistakably hers. Use any means short of murder. Get him gone. I don't care how. When the audio stopped, the silence was suffocating. Karen stood suddenly, slamming both palms on the defense table. "This is all fake," she shouted. "He staged this. He's a grifter. A squatter. This is a smear campaign." "Mrs. Sheldon," Judge Carver warned, "sit down." But Karen didn't sit. She erupted, ranting about conspiracies, infiltration, protecting property integrity, even accusing the court of bias. Deputies moved in as her voice cracked and spiraled into hysteria. The cameras flashed relentlessly. For the first time, the mask had fallen completely. Judge Carver gave one decisive bang of the gavel. "Mrs. Sheldon is removed from the courtroom." Security escorted her out, kicking and shouting, while reporters elbowed each other to capture the spectacle. The remaining proceedings moved fast. The verdicts came the next morning. Karen Sheldon, 14 years in state prison, criminal conspiracy, falsification of documents, harassment, coordinated unlawful entry. Henry Lott, 8 years, criminal trespass with intent, aggravated harassment, resisting arrest. Sentence reduced for cooperation. Craig Marlowe, 3 years suspended, $15,000 fine. Cooperated fully. Clearwater Bay, HOA, dissolved assets seized and transferred to a victim restitution fund. When the deputies loaded Karen into the transport van outside the courthouse, she looked nothing like the immaculate woman who had arrived the day before. She looked like someone who finally understood the truth. Her empire wasn't built on authority. It was built on fear. And fear always collapses under evidence. After the verdict, after the handcuffs, after the cameras stopped flashing and the reporters drifted off to chase the next storm, the woods finally felt quiet again. Not the false quiet, the ambush quiet, not the hush before a strike quiet, but real quiet. The kind that settles into your bones like warm sunlight on a winter morning. For the first time since I bought the cabin, I didn't wake up wondering what was lurking outside the windows. There were no footsteps at 3 a.m., no buzzing hum in the dark, no bark on a loop echoing through the trees. Just the sound of water tapping the lakeshore, the creak of pine trunks stretching in the cold, and the soft whistle of wind slipping through the needles. Colton stayed a few days longer, mostly to make sure nothing stupid happened after sentencing. On his last afternoon, we stood together at the edge of my drive, watching him pack the last of his gear into the Chevy. "You're good now," he said, shutting the tailgate. "HOA's dead. Karen's in prison. The board's scattered. Nobody's coming back here." I nodded. "Thanks to you," he snorted. "Thanks to evidence, and a man too stubborn to move." Before he climbed in, he handed me a small USB drive. "Everything's backed up, even the raw thermal footage. Put it somewhere safe." Then he paused, gave the cabin one long look, and said, "Funny thing, you came here looking for quiet. Instead, you started a movement." I watched his truck disappear down the gravel road until the dust settled back into stillness. That evening, I rebuilt the front gate. Not just repaired it, rebuilt it. New steel posts, a heavy crossbeam, fresh gauge chain, motion-triggered lights that hit like stadium lamps. And on the gate, I hung a new sign, red with white lettering. "No trespassing HOA, not recognized property, protected by law." For the first time, the sign didn't feel defensive. It felt like a declaration, a line drawn clearly and legally. Over the next week, I fixed the cabin the way it deserved to be fixed. Re-shingled the roof, swapped out every cracked window for tempered glass, replaced the warped floorboards, installed a wood stove that warmed the whole place with the smell of oak and cedar, and I built something new, a small deck facing the lake, just big enough for 2 chairs and a little table. The first night I sat out there, stars dropped all the way to the horizon. The water looked like a sheet of black glass. Somewhere out in the dark, an owl gave one long, low call that rolled across the surface like a blessing. That's when I heard the crunch of footsteps on the path. Not heavy, not hurried, old, careful. A letter had been tucked under a little stone near the porch steps, handwritten, the ink slightly shaky. The return name, Mabel Hoffman, one of the original homeowners, one who had stayed silent during the HOA's reign. Inside was a card and a recipe, a peach pie recipe. "Here's the real version," the note read. "Not the one Karen weaponized. Thank you for breaking the fever. The rest of us can breathe again." I laughed harder than I had in months. A full, open laugh that felt like knocking dust off a long, unused part of my chest. I pinned the recipe to the inside of the kitchen cupboard and baked it 2 nights later. It came out lopsided, a little burned on one edge, and sweet enough to make my teeth ache, but it tasted like victory and peace. Before the summer ended, I added one more sign to the gate, right below the legal notice. This one wasn't for deterrence, it was for me. Black letters on brushed steel. Smile, Karen. You're on camera. Just for old time's sake. The cabin finally felt like what it was meant to be from the start. Not a battleground, not a hiding place, but a home carved out of stubbornness, hard evidence, and a refusal to be pushed off what's rightfully yours. And as the sun dropped behind the pines that night, I realized something. Peace doesn't come from escaping trouble. It comes from standing your ground long enough for trouble to remember who it's dealing with.